to publish. The goal is to publish a comprehensive draft document containing the analysis and recommendations in November for public comment. All written submissions will be considered before finalization of the PCC's recommendations early in 2024. As we embark on this very important journey of a just transition, it is critical that we embed the principles of the Just Transition Framework in our implementation plans. As the PCC, we have been conscious about the challenges that many are facing in terms of getting financing for just transition projects. Accompanying large-scale commercially viable and therefore easier to finance projects and transactions must be accompanied by the means to finance and implement just transition projects. This work on the JTFM, as we call it, is driven by the need to address the market failure and the challenges that accompany this if we are to be true to the principle of justice in the Just Transition Framework. In particular, the negative impact of the transition on communities in the coal belt areas and those affected by climate events must be ameliorated by effective mechanisms for economic diversification, alternate livelihoods, and climate resilience projects. This is what our work on the JTFM seeks to find solutions for. With that, I'd like to welcome you warmly to the session. I look forward to robust discussions, and I'd like to now hand over to Deepak, who will take us through the more specific aspects of the JTFM. Thank you. Deepak, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shamini, and good morning, colleagues. It's good to see so many of you here. This, as Shamini has indicated, is a very important part of the Presidential Climate Commission's project and work program. As we know, the challenges related to finding ways in which to finance not only the just transition, but more specifically, the justice elements of the transition have caused us to have a deep understanding or require a deep understanding of where the problem areas, glitches, and potential market failures lie with respect to being able to find the tranching and the blending of finances that are required in order to ensure that the justice components of the transition do not fall behind or, in fact, in the worst case scenario, get totally ignored. It is in this context that this stream of work in the Presidential Climate Commission seeks to find ways in which to ensure that scarce grant components as well as concessional financing that might be available are in fact harnessed properly, are in fact aligned to the outcomes of our climate response, and more importantly, as we undertake elements of the transition, whether it be the just energy transition, whether it be the development of new technologies like green hydrogen and or electric vehicles, those spatial areas in which these transitions occur need to be given attention from the point of view of alternative livelihoods, as well as from the point of view of being prepared for a diversified economy post the impacts of the transition. In particular, in Mpumalanga, as we know, as the coal value chains go into decline, need to be assisted through a very specific set of mechanisms in order to ensure that those who are negatively impacted find alternative livelihoods as well as new economic opportunities. The project has had a number of iterations. We've had one stakeholder engagement in August. We've also, as we've looked at how we can map and tag just transition type of projects, also held focus groups. And we've reached a point in this project where we want to have the second consultation. As Shamini has indicated, this is by no means the end of the process. We do want to give further opportunities, both for direct as well as written feedback from stakeholders. I want to now hand over to Kwezi Kazi, who is the lead from the PCC on this project, to take us through some of the project specifics before handing over to the project team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepak. I'm not sure. Oh, yes, I am visible. Thank you so much, Deepak, for the welcome. I'm just worried because the project team is meant to be flighting the presentation. I'm not sure if they have access as panelists yet, but I am happy to start talking to the presentation.
I think, Kwesi, you'd rather start talking to it if you're comfortable. We're going to lose a lot of time otherwise. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair Shamini. So I think I want to start off as with talking about our agenda as the speakers of this consultation. So what our focus will be largely on communicating the objectives of this research, the consultations that we have held so far, our research findings to date, and what we propose as the direction of travel as the next step. So this project, this JTFM project, is a PCC commissioned piece of work. Thank you, Cecilia. I see that the presentation is up now. Okay, I'm just going to continue speaking. So this project is a PCC commissioned piece of work with the aim to identify. Can I have the next slide, please, Cecilia? Yes, thank you. All right, thank you so much. This project, as I was saying, is a PCC commissioned piece of work with the aim to identify the barriers that currently exist in the mobilization of just transition financing. So we've gone on to explore how a dedicated just transition facility can address these challenges. We hope to catalyze the relevant changes that are needed and that align with the needs and challenges of the just transition to the broader financial ecosystem. And lastly, we hope to examine the possible institutional arrangements that are most ideal to house the facility. Next slide. So in terms of the consultations that we've had so far, in July of this year, we held a focus group with broad stakeholders from the financial, the civil society, and other relevant sectors to basically get feedback on the tagging framework that we have developed that aims to match just transition projects by putting them through a set criteria that identifies the just and the social elements of these projects. We also touched on the possible institutional arrangements, and we received valuable inputs from the stakeholders, which then fed into the broader stakeholder consultation that we held in August this year. And the feedback from that session was also used to refine the further conceptualization of the JTFM. Next slide. So in the months of September and October, we held various targeted stakeholder consultations with identified stakeholders, such as the JET-IP PMU, the Infrastructure Fund Office, and we actually scheduled more of those consultations with the DBSA and the IDC, which were still to hold, I think, by the end of this month. And as far as those consultations go, we were hoping to obtain further feedback from these stakeholders. And as far as this consultation go, we hope to facilitate a discussion where we can talk about how we as the project team need to strengthen on the JTFM and the work that we've done so far, and what we foresee as the best implementation roadmap as far as the next steps go for the project. So let's talk about the background of the JTFM. What exactly is the problem that we are trying to solve? The PCC sees the just transition finance as financial investments that focus on both reducing carbon emissions and addressing the social and economic outcomes of moving to a low carbon economy. We aim to support the vulnerable workers and communities through this project and ensuring that the benefits of environmental sustainability are equitably distributed and that no one is left behind. It is at the back of this definition that we identified that the existing financial ecosystem is not adequately structured to mobilize and allocate finance for the just transition. And a key challenge here that we have noted as the project team is the mobilization of funding for the social and environmental justice elements of the low carbon transition. So what are the barriers that exist in the mobilization and allocation of just transition finance? Next slide, please, Cecilia. So we broke these down into 4 categories of conceptual challenges, of financial and economic challenges, of information and coordination challenges, and lastly, of market and structural challenges. And under conceptual challenges, what we have noted is the under recognition of just transition objectives in the existing financial ecosystem. We also noted the lack of standardized metrics that undermine the just transition considerations in project development and investment strategies, and therefore giving rise to the need for a tagging framework. Under the financial and economic challenges, we noted the current complex risk profiles of these projects. We also noted the small ticket size and how this actually increases the transaction costs of the projects. We noted the limited funding sources that are currently available for just transition projects, and also that there is currently a mismatch in investment horizons between these projects and the suppliers of finance. And then lastly, under financial and economic challenges, we noted that just transition projects actually require patent and long-term capital. And then as far as the information and coordination challenges go, we noted that there is currently an information gap in identifying these types of projects. We noted the lack of quality data for just transition projects. Also that there is fragmented efforts and there's an unclear role of the diverse actors within sort of the financial ecosystems, and this pertains to your TFIs, your MDBs, etc. And then equally, as we have a fear of greenwashing, we also noted the fear of just washing within the just transition financing projects. And then lastly, under the market and structural challenges, we have noted the externalities that exist. And this speaks to the traditional economic models that do not account for environmental and social costs. We also noted the algebraic approach that is at odds with the multidimensional focus of just transition. Please move on to the next slide, Cecilia. I do want to now hand over to Peter from the team at Prutham, which is part of our project team, and Peter will be presenting on the technical aspects of the JTFM. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. So we basically, if we move on to the next slide, Cecilia, I think there's been a strong burning platform outlined there by Kwesi of the need to scale financing, particularly for the just aspects of the transition. And as a result, we see a strong need for a dedicated facility or an ecosystem that is coordinated and is managed very carefully to achieve scale. Fundamentally, there are many aspects we'll go on to explain now that need to happen to create success within the ecosystem and to create scale of financing. But we need to stress very strongly, this is not a fund in the sense of a pot of money, given institutional issues, given the constraints of the fiscus. What we're talking about here is a mechanism that creates scale through its actions. I'll come on to talk about those actions in a minute, and enables basically the matching of the suppliers and demand for capital, particularly for the social aspects of the transition. We've concentrated on the social aspects of the transition because they are hard, because there are many market failures, as Kwesi said. And there is a belief, of course, that the other aspects of the transition can maybe more readily be financed with fewer market failures by the public and the private sector. So really, this is about catalyzing and overcoming those market failures. So if we move on to the next slide, Cecilia, the reason we need a dedicated ecosystem and we need a degree of coordination of management and experts working in this area is that we need to achieve all these things and the proposed functions of a just transition financing mechanism. Now, clearly, people in the finance space in South Africa, in the public sector, in the private sector, do elements of all of this at the moment. But the linking together of this to overcome those hurdles is what is not happening, or is if it is happening, it's not happening enough to achieve scale. So funding mobilization, I think, is a very interesting point. There have been teams in DFFE traditionally who try to do this. Treasury doesn't quite do this in terms of actually going out to G up funding for non-Treasury financing traditionally. The JETP PMU, of course, has been very good at understanding and categorizing and dealing with funding under JETP, but we're talking about the much broader funding needs here over our 30-year transition as a country. So funding mobilization is exceptionally important. That requires an understanding of the projects on the ground. It requires an understanding of those funders, and there will have to be people in the JTFM framework who are specialists in mobilizing this funding. Then there's project preparation, actually understanding the projects, getting the project ready. I don't need to tell people on this call, it's been in the press a lot and elsewhere, the problems of project prep in general for infrastructure. This is not unique to the just transition, albeit there are obviously specific aspects, particularly on the social projects that require additional support in project prep, is something that the facility will have to do and have specialist skills to undertake. But in particular, then it's the matching between the two, the providers and those who need capital. Again, this doesn't really happen in the public sector at the moment. The JETP PMU is now starting to do this, of course, around JETP. The private sector does this, traditional merchant bank might do this, but it's not done in a dedicated way currently on the social aspect. To do all this, to have access into the JTFM, as we said in our last engagement, requires tagging, requires some policy aspects, some approval, if you like, to get into this system. And that's really what the tagging is about. We're not going to go into tagging a huge amount of detail today. There is a lot of, in the documentation that was circulated, a lot more information that we welcome, certainly feedback on the tagging. But for us, tagging is an important aspect of the functioning of the mechanism. Then there's blending. Blending is thrown around a lot. What we mean here is the structuring of finance, the combination of different sorts, whether that's grant financing, philanthropies, who are obviously the new actors, I would say, in this transition versus traditional infrastructure financing, and then the private sector as well. This requires specialist skills which need to be housed, and again, is part of the matchmaking process, and is a specialist skill that needs to be there and actively done to achieve financing and to achieve de-risking, etc. Along the way. Project assessment is sort of a key thing around, I've sort of mentioned already, actually finding projects, actually being able to bring them to the party, and the same for stakeholder engagement and dealing with local communities and municipalities, which is, after all, where so many of these social projects are actually going to happen. And I think, it's all very well writing all this on a presentation, but at the end of the day, we're talking about hard to finance, very locally, very geographically specific often projects that will require a mechanism, an institution that is able really to have local presence, obviously particularly in Mpumalanga, but much broadly as the transition affects the whole country in different ways. And that includes capacity building in that space as well. And finally, a need to deal with institutional arrangements of the wider public sector as well. So I think it's the pulling together of these, which and all of these functions, which ultimately for us makes JTFM an interesting, exciting possibility. As I said, these all go on to some degree around the place at the moment, but in a cohesive sense, do not happen as a single institutional coordinated form. If we go on to the next slide, Cecilia, the growth of a JTFM, I think, and how it happens is obviously going to be very much dependent on a building platform, on the need to get it off the ground quickly. We've seen, of course, that there are other moves afoot as well. The JTP project management unit is also thinking about how they can roll out grant financing and other things through a financing mechanism. There are obviously wider moves by the private sector as well in terms of how to finance the transition at the moment. But there really is I think, a need to move at speed, and that's why we've sort of identified a sort of timeline here that we think is realistic. Things that are important, like being able to tag the projects quickly, identify projects, building pipelines, which is exceptionally important, as we've seen through the JETP process. There are really priorities up front and can create then the momentum for a wider momentum around the financing mechanism. And over the medium term, then these things are complicated to set up. The actual institutionalization of it, the actual ability to find and match financing becomes exceptionally important. I think JETP buys us a little bit of time in the short term to get this right in terms of a long-term institutional setup, but ultimately we do need to have eyes on a permanent, semi-permanent mechanism here, given the scale of financing required, given the complexity and the skills that will have to be brought together in able to do this. And there are many lessons we've talked as part of this process to people like the Infrastructure Fund, other climate finance funds in South Africa, other institutional forms. Roy will come on to speak about that in a second. So really, I think we need to think about an arc of how this thing forms. It's not going to be formed overnight. We're often talking about an ecosystem of best practice that can be pulled together to overcome those market failures that Kwesi was talking about. But I'll hand over to Roy, who will just go into a little bit more detail on some of the work we've done around institutional form and options on that front. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you very much, Peter. So as Peter said, you have to think about the institutional form and how this will be located, particularly within the legal constraints of the Public Finance Management Act and the Public Services Act. So we did a detailed analysis of the different options that we have available to us from a PFMA and a PSA perspective. And on the following slide, we cover some of those here just in brief. So under the PFMA, you can have a Schedule 2 entity. There we assess different models. So we didn't suggest that we're going to create it like this. We will assess different models that are created under Schedule 2. That would be the DBSA, the Trans-Caledonian Tunnel Authority, the IDC, and the Independent Development Trust. All of these are really interesting blended finance models, particularly TCTA, which has a really great way of creating a vehicle that can move finance from financing into obviously provision of water. Overall, under Schedule 2 entities, the DBSA scored highest for what we want this particular type of entity to achieve. So not only the DBSA as an entity itself, but also the model that the DBSA has, which is that it is a very efficient way of leveraging finance for specific social and other investments. The TCTA excels in capital mobilization, as I said, IDT in policy alignment, and the IDC in planning and advice. Some weaknesses were noted in terms of the technical assistance and capital mobilization across entities. Schedule 3 entities are quite complex. We did assess all of them. As Peter said, we don't necessarily, and the guidance from the PCC is that we mustn't see this as a fund, but rather as a way of mobilizing capital. There we analyzed the Road Action Fund, the National NSFAS and NYDA. All of them basically are funds, and they scored quite poorly against our metrics. We had a set of different metrics there. The other type of entity that we assessed with Public Services Act ones, there are two ones that do infrastructure financing, Gauteng Infrastructure Financing Agent and the Municipal Infrastructure Support Agent. And then also GTAC, which is a very successful entity established under the Public Services Act. GTAC emerged strongly, but the big disadvantage of these entities is that they are dependent on government funding. And what we're actually looking for, as Peter highlighted, is a way of mobilizing capital, not necessarily relying on the fiscus. So on the following slide, we set out in the report, and in the appendices, we go into quite a lot of detail about the pros and cons of all the different options. It was really striking to us that there's urgency. So we would like to get the JTFM up and running as quickly as possible. And for that reason, we advised that actually an existing entity would be best placed to do this. And out of the existing entities, DFIs obviously offer ready-made systems for JTFM management. Many DFIs already have some particularly climate or social funds that they manage on behalf of a variety of different entities. On the following slide, that brings us basically to the proposed direction of travel. So take into account, the idea that we need to get this done as soon as possible. There are lots of complexities in setting up a new entity, not least that a new entity will often require a legal framework, will need to be funded by the Treasury, will need to be allocated funds for staffing, management, etc., and needs a legal personality, because many of the things that the JTFM will need to do will require legal personality, in the sense that they'll have to potentially enter into agreements with concessional financiers and with philanthropies. And so there also needs a strong community engagement framework, and, as Peter said, really needs project preparation. And this allows us to align the JTFM with government and international bodies for policy coherence. So that kind of gives us a sense of the travel. On the following slide, I'll hand back to Peter for this.
Thank you very much, Roy. I think the thing just to reinforce is, whilst we talk about an institutional form and looking at institutions, the reason we do that is, despite calling it an ecosystem, is it has to have a central locus to be effective. I think there is clearly going to be an ecosystem here. There's clearly a lot of actors who will be pulled together. There is a lot of expertise. If you think back to that slide where I laid out all the different function of JTFM, you're never going to be able to, with 100% success, do that in one place in complete isolation. But equally, we think for success, you're going to have someone leading it, someone housing certain staff, someone housing expertise, and someone basically given a mandate, linked to compensation, saying this is ultimately your job to go and deliver that. In our reports, we've laid out a lot on governance, how that can ultimately happen. But that's how we sort of, if you like, square the circle on this, both being an ecosystem, but needing to have some central locus in terms of an institution. So we really are here, obviously, for feedback. We will hope that people have read some of the reports already. People have come to maybe the first interaction that we had on this, but we're particularly interested to hear from people how we can make this work at scale, how we can make this work at speed, how we can crowd in those functions and the expertise in the best possible way to create what is ultimately, we think, there needs to be an institutional form that has stickiness, given the length and the complexity of our transition. So just to go on to the next slide, Celia, we are going to be parceling the feedback we get here. We are listening very carefully on notes. We're passing it into a final version of the PCC's reports for consultation, which will be released in the near future. And then obviously then we have to think about implementation and actually making this thing happen. That's ultimately the burning platform here, is to achieve balancing of the social aspects of the transition at scale. But hopefully this has given a lot of food for thought, for feedback. But I'll hand back to Kwesi to kick things off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Roy, for those presentations. So as my colleague has just mentioned, obviously, we would love to get feedback from you as our broader stakeholders on where we can strengthen this project. We do realize that there has been a bit of urgency in terms of us planning the consultation, but we do want to assure you as well that we will continue to consult on this work and that this is not the last consultation that we will have. We will also be publishing the draft report for commentary on our website. So feel free to ask any questions that you might have right now. I am just here to facilitate those questions, and perhaps the project team can sort of field those questions. And yeah, I'm open to any questions you might have. I am looking at the Q&A. We don't seem to have questions as yet, but feel free to raise your hand. And I see Lufuno Tikalange Korombi has got his hand raised. I wonder if I can let you come in, Lufuno, so that you can share your question with everyone else.
Oh, thank you so much. The question that I have is on the slide where barriers were presented, but my question I wrote down was, do we currently have proposed solutions in terms of how we are going to deal with those challenges, or those are some of the things that when we do our written comments, we should also include what could be the solution to the existing barriers?
Thank you, Lufuno. I'm going to take other questions as well, and hopefully the project team can note some of these questions, and then we will do a round of responses, and then perhaps we will take in more questions. I also see Penny has her hand up. Penny, if you can come in, please.
Hi, thank you, Kukwazi, and thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, just a question on your transparency framework, and apologies, I haven't seen the report. I couldn't find the reference. Anyway, doesn't matter. The transparency framework, what would your transparency framework look like? And then with regard to that transparency, I'd like to ask a very specific question. So I think at the introduction, maybe it was Deepak that mentioned the grants. Perhaps, well, a question really, where can one find the information, recognizing that those grants are really scarce, what they have been used for so far? So in other words, from a transparency point of view, would you have a list of those grants and how the decision on those grants has been made? What has been utilized so far? And who has ownership of those? So who determines how the grants are going to be used? Is it the donor community, or is there country ownership? I think that would be very useful maybe as a start, because I suspect that quite a lot of the grant money has already been utilized. It was a question that we raised during the JET last year and didn't get any really clear response. So it would be great to see how your transparency framework is going to work and to what extent that there's any detail included in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Penny, for that question. Very important questions. And then we have Thabo Manana also has his hand up. Thabo, if you would please come in. Thabo, you are muted. Okay, I see Thabo has lowered his hand, so I'm going to move on to Mzonke. Mzonke, if you could just come in, Mzonke Nondwangu.
Good morning to all the stakeholders here, and good morning to the leadership of the PCC. I have two questions. Question one is to ask you, what about the companies? I'm speaking from a consultancy point of view, where we actually assist companies in terms of developing environmental sustainability strategies, as doing also the carbon footprinting. What about those companies that have already embarked and spent money? Will they be assisted by JETP? Also, the second question in terms of how do small companies like us become part to assist in the rollout and the implementation thereof? Thank you.
Thank you, Mzonke. Your questions are noted. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Commissioner Louise Nodea. Commissioner, if you could please just come in.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, and many very good minds applied to this question. I have just two comments. They needn't be questions. The one is I can't remember which slide it was, but it was something about what the purpose of a JTFM would be. And in there, you only spoke about the low carbon transition, whereas I think just transition, legitimately would mean money also going to resilience dimensions. So just that, I think we should factor that in. And then the other one is that there's much talk about communities, and the justice dimensions involving communities. But I think that there would be a strong case that we must also consider labor quite front and center in this. For example, a labor just transition project might be to, audit all their members in terms of their skills and capacities and desires for job redeployment, and money would be needed for that, as a small example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Louise. Lufuno, I see your hand is still up. I don't know if that's the legacy hand or if you want to come in before we go with our response. Okay, Lufuno is.
Okay, I will, sorry, like to come in again, sorry. I
Okay.
was still finding the mic. I don't necessarily have a question now, but in terms of the presentations that way, maybe it will also go with what the commissioner was saying, that when we do just transition, my understanding or observation is that we mostly an importer country, both the skills and the technology, and there is a need to look at how then do we do localization and how do you develop upskill, reskill, or develop new skills within, because it's a lot of cost to actually, it's costing South Africa at the moment a lot to import skills and these technologies. So there should be a plan that talks to how do we then promote local content, our own manufacturing, our own innovation, because in a sense, then it deals with issues of job losses, because if you are promoting your own local skills, your own local content, and you are developing your own skills, then it mitigates for job losses that would have happened and maybe hinder the just transition. So I'm just saying that we need to be thinking about how do we then move from any importer to someone or a country that is actively involved in also developing and manufacturing, because if you have already invested on imported goods and services and skills, now you need to move from that and to do something else that needs new sets of skills. It might also cause barriers or to facilitate this just transition, because there's already investment made and there isn't really anything that we are offering as a country in terms of, if you are transitioning, this is what we have localized or manufactured or developed that supports our own just transition without necessarily incurring too much costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Lufuno. I am going to take one last question. I see Khotso's hand is up, and then after that, I would like to move on to the responses, and perhaps we could have another round of questions following that. Khotso, if you could please just come in.
Hi, thanks. Kwesi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So my question is, and this may be a little premature, but how is the impact going to be monitored in terms of the number of applications, for example, successful or not, the impact of the intervention / project, and how often will that be done? And also, who will be doing that M&E? Who will be conducting that? So in the instance of, let's say, for example, DBSA getting involved, are they the ones that will be doing that? And just latching onto that, will there potentially be a dashboard that'll be developed for everyone to access the information, or will reports be distributed or written regularly at different frequencies? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Khotso. So I would just like to do a roundup of the questions that we currently have and then hand over to my panelists for the responses. We do have a question on the barriers and the solutions that currently exist that were noted, and whether or not the respondents or the stakeholders do have leeway to also make suggestions on what other barriers we could identify and what other barriers we have possibly left out, and if they could offer any solutions there too. And then the second question is around the transparency framework. We also had a question on the grant information, perhaps a deep dive and details on currently what that grant landscape looks like. And then we have a question on the existing consulting companies that have actually taken on this work and whether they will be assisted in continuing to do the work that they've been doing in the aspect of just transition, and how small businesses can actually get involved with this project. And then we have a question on whether or not resilience, or rather how or why resilience is not included in the sort of like framing of the need for just transition financing, and the consideration of labor just transition projects, because a lot of the conversation has been centered around communities. And then the last question we have was around the impact of this intervention, and whether there will be a monitoring of the rollout of the JTFM, and how other stakeholders can actually have access to the information, and whether or not this information will be rolled out on a regular basis, or if there will be a dedicated platform where people can access the information. So I am now going to hand over to my panelists. I do have on the line Peter, I have Roy, and I have Deepak, who will be responding to the questions. Deepak, do you want to come in and perhaps take a few of the questions?
Let Peter go first. I'm fine with that.
Okay, Peter, please do come in.
Sure, thank you for some great questions. I think to Lafuni's point in terms of the barriers, so we definitely welcome any feedback of barriers that we may have missed. I think if you link that slide to then the functionality of the JTFM, that is exactly why we talked about the functionality as it is. But just to run very briefly through some of the issues, I mean, the under recognition point we highlighted of just transition in the financial ecosystem. That's why we think tagging has a lot of value to the broader system, and that's the contribution in part of tagging beyond simply its role as sort of access into the JTFM. The same for the issue around the lack of standardized metrics, the complexity of risk profiles, small ticket sizes. This is why you need help matching projects to funding, and the key matching role that will be played. And in terms of limited sources of financing, this again is why you need a team that can go out and do the work to fully map the space, to map requirements, to map access. And I think that partly touches on the grants point that Penny raised in terms of the control of grants, either from a donor or a country perspective, needs to be understood well and communicated to projects. And again, that's something that the mechanism will do. In terms of information gaps as well, I mean, I think there's a lot of project prep that is supportive then. How project prep is communicated to funders is a key issue in terms of unlocking finance at scale. Again, is one of the ways of overcoming the barriers. So that's just a little bit of a taster. I think we go into in the report a lot more detail about how we overcome the barriers and how that links to the functionality that the JTFM will have to perform. In terms of Louise's questions around resilience and labour projects, I think that we frame this in terms of decarbonisation because for us, decarbonisation creates the imperative for labour projects. So it is people being made unemployed somewhere else who need to be retrained as a labour project. They don't necessarily have to be retrained, of course, in necessarily the green economy, whatever that means. It can be other things, but the imperative there comes from a decarbonisation impulse. The same in terms of resilience as well. We don't want to forget resilience. Resilience is within the tagging framework, and I think both labour and resilience projects would certainly, as we've conceived tagging, make it through. But we would welcome any feedback once you've gone through the report in terms of the details. If you think it wouldn't get through, I mean, we would definitely like to hear that and work with you on that feedback. Maybe I can hand to Roy just in terms of the transparency point and the sort of reporting point and the M&E point. These have been part of our consideration in the background around the structure and the sort of capacitation. But Roy, maybe you want to take those questions.
Yes, thank you, Peter. So very good questions around transparency and how we actually monitor and evaluate, obviously on an ongoing basis, how these funds are utilized and if they're utilized for the correct purposes. So in our evaluation process, what we did is we looked quite extensively at international best practice. The underlying technical reports, which were summarized into the final report, go into quite a lot of detail about international best practice in terms of what has happened in other jurisdictions. And we sort of evaluated monitoring and evaluation frameworks there and transparency and reporting frameworks there, which formed part of our final advice. And then in terms of the final recommendations, in terms of the institutionalization of the different types of structures that could be utilized for the JTFM, we highlighted that many of these have particularly those that are in existing DFIs. And there has been a long process of finding best practice for how these can be properly reported on, how transparency, particularly to grant funders and international DFIs, has been improved. And certainly many of them produce quite extensive annual reports and even in some cases quarterly reports, which sets out quite a lot of detail in terms of how the funds have been deployed, which I think is a very, very important, particularly for civil society. Then to the question about how grants flow through and where one can find information on grants. I mean, I think that is a very important question. The problem, as we know, is that, and one of the parts of our advice on this particular JTFM is that it doesn't become the be and end all of all transition financing. There will always be transition financing that takes place at a local level, or perhaps not necessarily through the JTFM. And I think one of the things that really has to be thought about is how does one aggregate information on how the flow of funds is taking place. And this is one of the things that a well-capacitated mechanism could be given, because I think it's a very good question in terms of to whom are these funds going and how exactly are they being deployed and under what circumstances, and particularly what conditions, because I think that links to another point which really came up a lot in our consultations, which is that often money comes pre-conditionalized. So, I mean, for obvious reasons, philanthropies or donors will require that their funds are used for particular purposes, maybe for job creation, or for, in many cases, they come with requirements for certain gender outcomes. And it's quite difficult sometimes for the country to change those requirements. And so that is certainly something that one has to think a little bit about in more detail. So I think that hopefully answers those questions.
Thank you, Roy. But I think that's the point, that the mandate of a JTFM is to thread that needle, that complexity of conditionality from a huge range of different financiers and grant givers versus then the knowledge of the project. And that's the fundamental point of matchmaking, and why one might conceive of JTFM as like a merchant bank in the traditional old school sense of making finance happen. Making that link happen. But maybe I'll pass to Deepak to take the grant and some of the other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. On the question of grants, which I will start off with, Penny, you're aware, as the rest of us are, that number one, even our president has indicated that particularly in the JETP package, the grant component was inadequate. And so we are faced with, as we look at unfolding the transition, what do we do with the conditionalities that often accompany these grants? And if they're not conditionalities, what are the focus areas of the grantees? And in this respect, we know that a lot of these grantees have preconceived ideas about where to disperse or allocate these grants. And one of the things we realized very early on in this project is that we needed this tagging framework in order to ensure that while we do not have a policing or a decision-making function as the PCC in this respect, that we wanted to be clear about what we would consider from the PCC's point of view to be just transition projects, so that those providers of not only grants but other types of capital towards these projects could then be in some ways harnessed, aligned, and then hopefully persuaded to be consistent with what the needs of the just transition are. I'll also call on, as soon as I've finished speaking, on Neil Cole, who is on the call, who might be able to share some perspectives with respect to the grant component of the JET-P package. Louise has raised a number of issues which I think are quite critical, and while not seemingly directly in this project, certainly are allied pieces of work that the PCC is conducting. So, for example, with respect to tagging, the issue of negatively impacted workers goes into the process of determining how much scoring, for want of a better word, a project will get if, in fact, it is dealing with issues related to mitigating the negative impact on workers. I suppose at an institutional level, and this is food for thought, both for the project team and for us in the PCC, is there an institutional role to be played by labor in an organized format, particularly at the local level? And I think certainly, Louise, if that is what you were alluding to, it's food for thought for us to take back into the project and look at whether, in fact, we need to strengthen that element. Similarly, I think we've handled the role of local government, in particular with respect to local project development and determination, but a similar issue would be applicable to the municipal level, and we certainly take that also back into the project team's enunciation of the next draft of this report. With respect to localization, again, very, very similar. We see that it is not only local communities and individuals who should be seen to be addressed through the JTFM, but in fact, we need to strengthen local economies through a portfolio of transition projects, particularly in those areas where either climate impact itself or climate events themselves, or where the transition has a negative impact on the existing economic system in those local areas. I think the role, for example, of SMMEs is going to be critical as we look at how we get sustainable development through a proper application of just transition project finance mechanisms. Finally, with respect to industrialization as it relates to localization, at the moment, it's out of the scope of this particular project, but in our critical appraisal of the JET IP as the PCC, we do make the point that there needs to be a coherent approach to industrial strategy and policy as it relates to the localization, particularly of larger scale manufacturing opportunities that accompany the just transition and the associated supply chains. On monitoring and impact, we think we've covered it, but a lot will depend on the way in which we then align and articulate with another piece of the PCC's work. And this relates to a monitoring and evaluation framework. And while it is not directly within the scope of this particular project, I would like to think that as we put the pieces together of the sum total of the PCC's role in monitoring and evaluation going forward, this certainly, how are we doing with respect to just transition financing for projects that otherwise, if we simply left it to commercial and the existing financial ecosystem would be left behind, how are we doing with respect to making a successful effort and making an impact on ensuring that just transition finance or just transition projects do in fact get both project developed and financed and then implemented. Thank you. I'm just wondering if Neil wants to come in at this point.
Yes, we have promoted him as a speaker. Neil, if you want to come in to just elaborate on the grant, please do come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwesi. Thank you, Deepak, and great presentations. So maybe a couple of points on the grants. That seems to be, always an area of concern. So I want to cover just how grants are managed. especially when grants come in as official development assistance, and then just give a sense of where we are in terms of the grant amounts that have been pledged since COP26, when the IPG pledges were announced, and where we stand at the moment. So typically when grants are pledged as official development assistance, there's a formal announcements that are made by the representative of the country making the pledge, and it is then also reported by the National Treasury's International Development Cooperation Unit, and that is typically reported as part of the financial statements and also included in the budget. But not all grants go that route. And when we look at the grants that have been pledged towards the JET IP, they are the grants that are coming in as official development assistance, and then there's also grants that are going directly to recipient projects, CSOs, etc. And it's for that reason that the JET IP Project Management Unit has developed a grant register. So it's going to be it is a register of all the grants broken up in terms of their priority areas, and where the projects have already been identified, that will also be indicated. We've agreed with stakeholders that the information from the grant register will be made public, and we still need to determine how that public reporting on the grant register is going to happen. So at the time of COP26, we reported in, about 12 months later, when we published the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, we reported an amount of $329 million in grant pledges. So that works out to just over 5 billion rand. We've received further pledges from the regional IPG group. There are also now new international partners who we refer to as the IPG Plus, and that would be Netherlands, Netherlands and Denmark. And then there are also 3 countries that have not joined the IPG, Spain, Canada, and Switzerland, that have made pledges. Now, often when we get the pledge is in the form of a financing package. So there'll be a grant amount, there'll be concessional loans typically, and there'll be commercial debt and equity typically. Where we are at the moment is, in terms of grants, is at $766 million. So that would be into slightly sort of around 11 billion South African rands. So certainly progress in terms of the mobilization of grants. It's still the smallest component if one looks at the various instruments in the JET IP mobilized finance. So certainly, also working with our partners to ensure that the quality of the financing improves, but also that we ensure that there is fit for purpose and enough fit for purpose financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. So I don't know if we have more points that we could make around how small businesses can get involved. I see there's a comment on the chat about how we need to start moving away from consultation and engagement, and perhaps move towards collaboration, where we could have smaller businesses within these communities actually being part of this process. So I was wondering if perhaps Deepak could come in and maybe talk to how smaller businesses have been considered for the JTFM, and perhaps to a forward-looking sort of like trajectory of when and how small businesses can get involved.
So I think that's a really good question, because at this point in time, most people, when we, me included, when we talk about grants, we make an assumption that these are grants coming from abroad as a result of the magnanimity of the global north or the developed world. I think there's a potential to start raising the bar as it relates and pressurizing the local philanthropy as well as corporate community to begin to allocate funding towards local projects that accompany their own either spatial location or their own transitional plans. So I think the other point with respect to moving from consultation to collaboration, point really well made. And once again, PCC, while we're not dealing with that in this particular work stream, are in the monitoring and evaluation areas, for example, looking at what the role of local communities as well as civil society would be in the collaborative effort. The final point I also wanted to make, excuse me, with respect to grants, and Shamini raised this with me, is that we're doing another project, which is mapping of climate finance. And while the current iteration, which will be launched in November, as a measure of where climate finance comes from, where it goes to, how much for mitigation, adaptation, as well as dual purpose, there is not sufficient methodological attention being given to the grants. And going forward in the iteration, just for transparency, I think we will include a proper determination of the flow of grants, both international and domestic, to various areas, whether those be finally adaptation or mitigation. Back to you, Kwesi.
Thank you for that, Deepak. I've also noted a question on the involvement of the financial sector and our commercial banks on this work. And I would just like to point out that the PCC will actually be hosting a financial sector dialogue where we aim to actually speak to the financial sector about the work that we have been doing with the JTFM, and hopefully getting feedback from them on how they can be involved in the process. And now I want to move on to the second round of questions. I see Penny's hand is up with the hope that all the questions in the first round have been responded to. I do see that there's also questions that have been posted in the Q&A, and our ED has kindly been responding to those questions. But I would just advise attendees as well that if you do have a question, please do post it in the Q&A or raise your hand just to avoid your questions getting lost within the comments of the chat. So I will now move on to Penny. Penny, if you could please just come in.
Thanks again, Kwesi. Yeah, this is just following up on the transparency question and Roy's response. And, you know, I think we should recognize that this is not business as usual, but we're operating really in a business unusual space, especially as far as the transition and justice is concerned, and therefore transparency. So Roy, I was just slightly concerned about your response regarding international best practice, because international best practice in a old steady state regime might look very different. And I think we need to question whether transparency from an international best practice doesn't need some looking at. And what I would like to raise here is that a lot of this financing potentially will be financing public purpose assets. And public purpose assets and private sector. And private sector has an unfortunate reputation of not wanting too much transparency. So I would, my wish really, and I know this is not, it's not all about what I wish, but I really would wish, based on my experience, that we address transparency from a public purpose perspective, especially even where private sector is involved. And we don't have anywhere near enough transparency, and you can't treat a public sector entities and private sector entities financing public sector assets differently. So it would be great in the report ultimately to include not just international best practice, but question international best practice, and then suggest a way forward for transparency in the main. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Penny. I think your comment has been noted. But Roy, if you do just want to come in and give us some assurance that these issues will be considered in the final report.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I'm sorry, Penny, what I meant by international best practice is actually a very critical assessment of international best practice. Certainly not to just take it as read that international best practice is always the best. There's some very interesting cases where you know, people have tried quite hard to improve transparency. But I think, I mean, I would agree with you that particularly with some of those very large funds, sometimes transparency is a concern, and we will definitely put in some thoughts on that in the report.
Thank you for that, Roy. I don't see any more hands. I see Penny's hand is still up. I don't know if that's a legacy hand, Penny. Okay, it's gone down. So I do not see any more hands. If we don't have, okay, I see there's a hand from Lufuno. Lufuno, you can please come in.
Thank you so much. I just need to maybe verify something. I do attend a few meetings that deals with climate change because it's an area that we are pursuing, but I have not necessarily seen if all the, I'll give an example with like the PCC and the NPC is just an example. So that's what I'm saying is clearer, that if you are attending an NPC meeting, the National Planning Commission, they will be talking about just transition and climate issues. And then you come to the PCC, we're talking more or less the same thing. So my question is, at what point are we moving from a siloed approach to a collaborative approach? Because it also impacts on the resources that we don't have. That if we are in a way duplicating things, then it means we are duplicating the resources, which also has challenges, I think, as highlighted earlier. So I'm just wondering at what point are we bringing everything together? We have one single point of contact for this particular point, and everybody else, including us from the private sector, or small business, we are contributing to that, not necessarily everybody doing their own thing. So my observation, I am not seeing that collaboration. I'm seeing silo initiatives that I'm not so sure at what point do they meet. Thank you.
Thank you for that very important question, Lufuno. It's been noted. I'm going to take a couple more hands, and then I will have some of our panelists then get back to all the questions and provide responses. I see Andile Mlambo, your hand is up. Do you want to come in with your question? Andile? Okay, I think Andile is having a bit of technical issues because he's not muted. I'm going to move on to Landiwe. Landiwe, please do come in.
Thanks, Kwesigazi. My sound is not that great. If the problem, please, I wanted to ask the question. I just want to, I saw a reference to blended finance, and I thought perhaps if one of your panelists can speak much more about it. What are we talking about at the risk management perspective? Are we, who are you going to blend with, and then what kind of an instrument this would take? I thought maybe somebody can speak more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Landiwe. I'm going to move back to Andile. Andile, if you could please just come in before we take our responses. Okay, I think Landiwe is unable to come on. So I am going to move on to my panelists. I think we need to cover two critical questions, and that speaks to the collaboration of the different state entities on this subject of the just transition. The general feeling is that currently everyone is working in a siloed approach, and perhaps we could find more value in integrating our resources and making sure that people have a clear understanding of where to go, which institution to go to for whatever answers that they require. And then the second question that we have speaks to the blended financing, who we are blending with in these instances, and what sort of like transaction structures we're looking at when we talk about blended financing. So I am going to hand over to Deepak.
Thank you very much. And that question of collaboration, alignment, integration is at the heart of what our problems are, both within government as well as between government and other role players and sectors. In this respect, we are very mindful of that fragmentation that exists, and therefore are playing a key role in ensuring, for example, that in the Mpumalanga province, just by way of example, that the fragmentation that might exist between national, provincial, and then locality that is involved in the transition is addressed properly as a set of interfaces that need to work within government itself. With respect to broader national institutions, we are also cultivating the kind of partnership that is required across the public system. And examples of these would be the way in which we now interact collaboratively, as well as looking forward to alignment with, in the first instance, the JET IP PMU in the presidency, which is charged, as colleagues will know, with both the development and implementation of the JET IP. But secondly, in a number of project areas, to the point, I think it was Lufuno who made it, the national, PMU, as well as in terms of DBSA, IDC, not only do they have commissioners on the PCC, but we are engaging with them quite intensely in specific project areas, as well as specifically to get, for example, the DFIs to agree to collaborate across their respective mandates so that we can have maximum impact on the just transition. With respect to blended finance, there are some people who wonder whether blended finance isn't a smokes and mirror element of financing. But from our point of view, we see blended finance as multiple sources and tranches of finance whose providers have different needs. And therefore, the ability to bring these tranches together for impact is of critical importance. So again, by way of example, in the just transition project area, we would say that relatively scarce grant financing needs to offer the opportunity to either reduce the cost of capital or be used for coherent project development as well as project implementation plans, which can then confidence of the commercial financial sector to assume and agree that the risks associated with how they see the world are mitigated. So a typical blend would be at the bottom of the stack, a grant component, which usually does not have to be returned, followed by, on top of that, concessional financing, which has relatively low cost of capital terms, as well as longer duration and patience associated with it. And if the project that is being proposed makes sense because it has developed to that point, then one could approach either project by project or a portfolio of projects to the commercial lending sector to begin to scale up. And therefore, what we have is very limited tranches of either free grant capital or concessional capital being able to scale up and leverage commercial capital, which allows you to do much, much more than the grant capital itself on its own would have been able to do.
Thank you for that response, Deepak. I hope we are sufficiently covered. I don't see any more hands. I'm assuming that everyone is sufficiently settled. Landiwe and Lufuno. Landiwe, do you want to come in? Okay, I guess that was a legacy hand from Landiwe.
It's an old hand, sorry.
No worries. Let me move on to Lufuno. Lufuno, do you just want to come back in?
Thank you so much. I hope this is my last question. Earlier, my colleague asked a question around the involvement of SMMEs, so I'm going to ask the question differently. I will go back to the question I asked earlier, which is in terms of barriers, and then if we are to add solutions, and I believe the response said yes. So I wanted to check in terms of innovation. When you have an innovation or a proposal on how we can innovate better to do this just transition, how do you then communicate with the PCC, or you wait for a meeting and you ask to present, or what happens? Like, how do we engage with the PCC in terms of innovation that we might be thinking around that could help with the challenges that we are having in terms of just transition? Thank you.
Thank you, Lufuno, for that question. I'm going to hand back over to Deepak. And I think this is our last question. I am mindful of time, so Deepak, please do come in.
Firstly, to Lufuno, I want to say we would welcome any ideas that innovate in order to achieve outcomes. And in this respect, I referred to, for example, the work that we're doing for collaboration across DFIs. And amongst those DFIs that we would like to see collaborating with each other are not only the DBSA, which, for example, through their D-Labs program, encourage the development and growth of SMMEs in local areas. We also have in that collaborative forum the National Empowerment Fund, whose almost prime mandate is, in fact, to promote SMMEs as well as projects that catalyze the development of new companies. And if there are novel or innovative ways in which we can either facilitate the better performance of SMMEs and provide assistance in this respect going forward, or find ways of raising and encouraging both the public and private financial sector to support SMMEs to a greater extent than they do now, we welcome that. Finally, I think I want to make the point that particularly in the areas, value chains and localities that are currently dependent on the coal value chain, it is of absolute and critical importance that the current SMMEs which rely on those value chains are also assisted to transit to new value chains. This also then perhaps leads to a question which Louise raised earlier, and that is of skills. And here, when we talk about skills, I think people narrowly look at skills as just training of a technical nature, which allows them to do a particular job. I think training needs to be broadened to include training for entrepreneurship, training as well for running smaller businesses, and to ensure that the entrepreneurial capabilities of the country are also assisted to make this transition successfully. I think Lufuno's hand is up again.
Lufuno, is that a legacy hand, or do you have a follow-up question?
It's down.
Oh, legacy hand.
Sorry, legacy, sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much to all our participants for the questions. I do not see any more hands, so I assume that we are all sufficiently covered. I do want to hand over back to Deepak. Yeah, I think my job is done for the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwezi, for so elegantly and professionally steering this discussion and Q&A session. For me, all that's left is to say thank you very much for attending. I do want the ED to make some closing remarks. The way forward for elaborating the Just Transition Framework, I'm just going to repeat the steps. This is the second of our stakeholder consultations, is by no means the end of our engagement with stakeholders on this issue. The next steps would be that the draft report is available on the PCC website. The presentation that was made today will also be available on the website. We would welcome at any point written comments back to us. We do intend to take this through a couple of iterations, also with additional specific stakeholders. And finally, in November, publish a draft report for public comment before we take it through the PCC process for finalization as a set of recommendations very early in the new year. I know some people might say there is urgency with respect to implementing these projects. However, we as the PCC want to ensure that the voice of stakeholders, particularly stakeholders who will be impacted by or participate in the opportunities created by the JTFM, have their say with respect to what the recommendations finally look like when the PCC adopts them very early in the new year. With those words, I want to say thank you very much for an engaging conversation on this particular topic, and hand over to Dr. Crispian Olver, our Executive Director, to make some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. I didn't really expect to say anything. I was quietly answering questions in the Q&A by way of support, and enjoying listening to what I thought was a really stimulating webinar. And I mean, maybe just to say, you know, we should not underestimate what we're trying to do. In the world of climate finance, you know, we've you know, over the last few years, I think, come to terms with certainly how the mitigation finance needs to flow. We know that adaptation's getting a much lower proportion of finance, so we need to move to get funding to flow better into adaptation. But the just transition terrain is at, you know, a much less developed state. And there's a whole lot of confusion around definitions about what qualifies as a just transition project, and how to thread this needle, which is how do we, you know, given that we have a very limited pool of grant money and a much deeper set of capital markets and private funding, how do we bring private funding, which is essentially, you know, commercial for profit, seeking a commercial return, how do we deploy it into just transition projects, which are, you know, by their nature, more social and empowerment oriented, and not necessarily focused on commercial operations. And this was the question posed in the chat. And in fact, of all the questions I was typing answers to, I thought that really cut to the heart of what we're trying to do here. So the proposals that have been put on the table to, you know, first of all, get a proper information, standardized information, a tagging system up and running, play this matchmaking role, linking funds that are available and projects that are seeking funding, playing a pipeline development role. So, you know, nurturing projects from the early concept stage through feasibility into bankability and ultimately implementation. There's a desperate need for these kinds of mechanisms. So the topics we're discussing and your inputs into this topic, make no mistake, are extremely important, and I'm really looking forward to the results of this process when it comes to a conclusion. So well done, everyone. Well done to all the speakers. Well done to the Secretariat team for pulling this together. And most of all, everyone that was participating in the discussion, thank you very much. Your inputs are very valuable. It's basically the bread and butter of what we do, and we value it very much. So thank you.